The first thing Daniel heard was his daughter's voice cutting off mid-laugh. Then the monitor went flat. The pediatric ICU exploded into motion. Nurses shouting orders, a code cart slamming through the doorway, the shrill alarm drilling straight through his chest. "Mr. Reed, you need to step back." He couldn't. His feet were rooted to the tile as he watched strangers fight for the little girl whose whole heart had always belonged to him. Someone pulled him toward the hallway anyway, his hands leaving sweaty prints on the rail of Kayla's bed. Out in the corridor, the fluorescent lights felt too bright, the floor too steady for a world that was falling apart again. Behind the glass, he saw chest compressions. A flash of tiny socks with cartoon stars, a doctor he'd never met before taking charge. Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed to get in there, to do something, to call out corrections like he used to in the tower. Left 10 degrees, climb now, turn back. But this wasn't a plane. This was his child's heart stuttering on a screen. And he was nothing now but a $40 a shift parking attendant who'd convinced himself he could outrun one tragedy in his life. At the far end of the hallway, the mayor burst around the corner, hair wind-blown blazer, half on security trailing behind. Her eyes found his. Lydia Hart. The woman whose battles he'd stepped into. The woman whose problems had yanked him into this moment. If we lose her, Daniel thought I should have kept my head down in that booth and never said a word. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. The truth is, this story didn't start in a hospital hallway. It started months earlier in a concrete box under City Hall, where nobody ever bothered to learn his name. Most people only saw the orange vest through their windshield, a quick wave toward the booth, maybe a crumpled receipt, and then they were gone. But Daniel Reed, 39 years old, ex-air traffic controller turned night shift parking attendant, saw everything. License plates, patterns, the way people's shoulders sat when they were lying. By 10 p.m., the daytime suits were gone, and the quiet settled in. That's when he did his second job, scrolling medical portals on his phone, double-checking insurance statements, counting and recounting the money in his worn leather notebook. Kayla was 7. Bright, stubborn, obsessed with space documentaries and grilled cheese sandwiches. And she had a heart that thought it was a drum soloist racing when it shouldn't, skipping beats when it mattered most. The doctors called it an electrical conduction disorder. Daniel called it a ticking clock. The ablation procedure they recommended could give her a normal life. It could also drown him in bills. His savings didn't come close to touching, not after what happened in the tower 2 years earlier. 2 jets on intersecting paths. Fog. A glitchy radar sweep. One call he made half a second too late. The investigation board said equipment failure. The families didn't care whose name went on the report. Neither did Daniel. He knew whose voice had been on that frequency. He walked away from the FAA, from the tower, from the only job he'd ever trained for. Took whatever work would keep a roof over Kayla's head and her pill bottles from running empty. Nights at the garage. Weekends cleaning offices. Days at home whenever her heart decided to misbehave. He didn't date. Didn't see friends. Didn't talk about the crash. His world had narrowed to one kid, one beat-up Corolla, and a stack of medical brochures he kept face down on his kitchen table. The first time he saw Mayor Lydia Hart in person, she was on a screen in the booth, muted, giving a speech about revitalizing downtown and protecting working families. The first time he met her in real life, it was almost midnight, the rain was coming in sideways, and she was running through his garage with terror in her eyes and blood on her sleeve. That was the night Daniel stepped out of the booth. That was the night everything began to unravel. Daniel learned quickly that helping a powerful person, accidentally or not, came with people who wished he'd stayed in his booth. It started the next morning, long before sunrise. when the city was still wrapped in that blue-gray quiet that made everything look gentler than it really was. He pulled into the garage for his shift coffee in hand, intent on keeping his head down after what had happened with the mayor the night before. There were already murmurs among the attendants, the kind of low voices that stopped when he got close enough to hear. He didn't need the words. He'd worked among people too long not to understand the tone. Curiosity sharpened with suspicion. The look that said, "Who do you think you are?" He hung up his jacket, scanned in, and started his rounds through the lower level. A few minutes later, Luis, the senior attendant, cornered him by the maintenance closet. Luis wasn't a bad guy, just someone who'd stayed in one place too long and learned to protect his tiny kingdom with sharp elbows. "You in trouble?" Luis asked, without looking at him, pretending to restock paper tickets. "No," Daniel answered, honest and short. "Just a strange night." That's so Luis's eyebrows lifted. Strange how Daniel considered a dozen safe answers, but none would change anything. "Just doing my job." Luis snorted softly, shaking his head. "Well, just make sure your job doesn't drag the rest of us into something. The mayor showing up here at midnight with blood on her shirt, people notice that. Cameras notice that. Upper office notices that. There it was, the first flicker of mistreatment, subtle but sharp. A warning disguised as concern. A suggestion that he'd stepped out of line by simply helping someone who needed help. "I didn't bring her here," Daniel said. "Doesn't matter," Luis replied. "Just don't start thinking people like her are your friends. They don't look twice at people like us unless they want something." Daniel didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that silence was safer than arguing, especially with men who believed the world owed them more than they got. But the comment sat under his ribs like a stone. People like us. He didn't know where he fit anymore between the person he used to be and the man he was forced to become. By mid-morning, the tension in the garage had grown thick enough for him to feel it. Drivers giving him odd glances. A councilwoman's aide lingering too long near the booth, eyeing Daniel as if memorizing his face. Even the police cruiser that rolled through on routine patrol slowed down just enough to remind him someone had taken notice. He wasn't sure what he expected when he returned home, but it wasn't Kayla sitting at the kitchen table with her shoulders slumped and her head resting on her arm. The little girl who usually greeted him with a grin barely looked up. "Tough morning?" he asked gently. She nodded, her curls falling over her face. "School called. They said if I'm dizzy again, I have to stay in the nurse's office next time." Daniel pulled up a chair. "Did you get dizzy today?" "A little." She touched her chest lightly, the way she always did when the fluttering started. "I missed the beat in music class. Everyone else kept playing, and I had to hold my drum because my heart was acting weird again." The ache hit him instantly, deep and familiar. She didn't complain often, she was too brave for that, but every missed beat cut him open in a way he'd never learned to express. "Then I got tired," she added. "My teacher asked if everything was okay. I didn't want to tell her about the surgery." "Why not?" She shrugged. "Kids whisper when teachers talk too quietly. I didn't want them whispering about me." He brushed her hair from her forehead. "You didn't do anything wrong." She nodded, but he could tell the words didn't reach her. And that was the part that broke him, the quiet sadness of a child trying to keep up with a body that wouldn't follow her spirit. He made her soup for lunch, though she only ate half before lying on the couch, exhausted. He sat nearby, pretending to read emails, but really watching her breathing pattern the way he'd watched radar sweeps back in the tower, fast, slow, steady, faltering, waiting for something he hoped he wouldn't see. Around 3 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a call from the City Hall office. He almost didn't answer. But he did. "This is Daniel Reed. Mr. Reed, this is Deputy Director Collins. The mayor asked that you come in tomorrow morning to give a statement about last night." A statement. Not a thank you. Not an explanation. A statement. "Is she okay?" Daniel asked. "She's fine, but we need clarification on certain details." The pause before details told him everything. He hung up, feeling smaller than he had the night before, when adrenaline had blurred his sense of consequence. He'd helped someone, and now he might be dragged into political fallout he never asked for. He didn't belong in that world, didn't want to be near it. When Kayla woke from her nap, she found him at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a battlefield. "Daddy," she asked. He forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart. You hungry?" She approached slowly, studying his face in a way children do when they haven't yet learned to pretend they don't notice adult fear. Did something bad happen at work? He opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. Just a complicated day. She slid into his lap without another word, her small hand resting over his heart, as if trying to calm whatever was trembling inside him. That evening, they walked to the corner store together. On the way back, a black SUV slowed near the curb. The window rolled down halfway, revealing a man in a suit Daniel didn't recognize. "You Daniel Reed," Daniel stiffened. "Who's asking?" "Just checking something," the man said, then drove off without giving a name. Kayla grabbed his hand tighter. "Daddy, why did he look at you like that?" Daniel didn't know how to answer. He only knew one thing with certainty. People were watching him now, and he didn't like it. By the time he tucked Kayla into bed, something inside him had begun tightening, a slow, rising tension that felt like standing on the catwalk of the tower again, waiting for two blips to drift too close. He cleaned the apartment just to keep his hands busy. When his phone buzzed again, he almost ignored it. But it was a message from an unsaved number. "We need to talk. Urgent. LH, the mayor." He stared at the screen far longer than necessary. Every instinct told him to leave this alone, to stay small, stay invisible, stay safe. He had a daughter to protect, a surgery to afford, a past mistake that still stalked him in quiet moments. But whatever had happened last night, whatever blood had been on her sleeve, was tied to something bigger than he'd realized. He stepped out onto the balcony for air. The city hummed below, unaware of the storm gathering. Inside, Kayla coughed softly in her sleep. Daniel closed his eyes. He wasn't sure whether he was being pulled into someone else's trouble or pushed there by fate. All he knew was that pressure was building on all sides at work, in the shadows, in his bank account, in his daughter's heart. And something inevitable was coming. He felt it in the air, the same way he used to feel turbulence before the instruments caught it. Tomorrow at City Hall, the dam would break. City Hall looked different in daylight. Bigger, colder, like a stone giant that judged every person walking through its glass doors. Daniel had been here only once before, years ago, to dispute a parking ticket. That day, he'd been invisible. This morning, every security officer seemed to track him with their eyes. He kept replaying the strange message from the mayor, though she hadn't sent anything since. "We need to talk. Urgent. No explanation. No follow-up." The only thing he knew for sure was that whatever she wanted from him now, it wouldn't be simple. A staffer escorted him through metal detectors and down a hallway lined with framed portraits of past leaders, stern men, and carefully smiling women staring down as if measuring the worth of whoever walked past. The staffer glanced at him once with mild curiosity, then looked away. The kind of look Daniel had grown used to, a quick scan, a private verdict. "The mayor's expecting you," the staffer said, tapping on a frosted glass door before ushering him inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, Daniel sensed something was wrong. Mayor Lydia Hart wasn't at her desk. She was standing in the corner of the room, sleeves rolled up, papers scattered everywhere. Two of her advisors hovered nearby, one pale and nervous, the other red-faced with anger. An older man in a charcoal suit stood nearest to her, arms crossed, jaw locked. He looked like the kind of man who didn't flinch in fires or arguments. Lydia looked up the moment Daniel entered. Relief flickered across her face, quick, nervous, something she tried to hide. "Thank you for coming," she said. "What's going on?" he asked. The advisor with the red face snapped before the mayor could answer. "What's going on is that you—" He jabbed a finger in Daniel's direction, were the last civilian seen with the mayor before an attempted break-in at her residence. Daniel froze. "What? We're determining whether it's coincidence," the advisor continued, voice sharp, "or whether someone followed the mayor because of you." Lydia stepped forward. "Derek, enough." But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had heard it. Accusation by implication. Daniel swallowed the sting. He was used to being underestimated, ignored, even judged for mistakes no one else knew about, but being treated as a potential threat, or worse, a liability to a public figure, was something else entirely. "I didn't bring danger to her," Daniel said quietly. "I drove her here because she was hurt. Hurt how Derek demanded." "He didn't cause it," Lydia snapped. "And he didn't contribute to the break-in attempt. He helped me when no one else was around." The man in the charcoal suit studied Daniel's face carefully, the way a seasoned detective evaluates a witness. "Mr. Reed," he said calmly, "there's something you need to see." He turned on a monitor mounted to the wall. Grainy footage played a shadowed figure trying to pry open the back entrance of the mayor's townhouse, less than an hour after she'd arrived home last night. The intruder moved with experience, not clumsy or panicked, deliberate. "We believe they were searching for documents," the man said, "or access to communications, something that would compromise the mayor." Daniel watched silently. The figure worked efficiently, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. "Do you recognize him?" Derek asked, tone dripping suspicion. "No," Daniel said. The man in charcoal turned off the monitor. "Mayor Hart, if he's involved, you need to say so before this becomes a public matter." Lydia's expression hardened. "He is not involved, and you are not interrogating someone who saved my life." Her voice, sharp, resonant, cut through the room. Even the advisors fell silent. Saved her life. Daniel blinked. She had never said those words last night, but before he could question it, the man in charcoal stepped closer. "We need a statement," he said. "Not later, now." Daniel felt the walls closing around him. He thought of Kayla at home, resting after another dizzy spell. He thought of the surgery deadline shrinking every day. He thought of the people watching him, even the SUV that slowed down yesterday. And now this room full of suspicion and power. "Fine," he said. "I'll tell you everything I saw. But you need to tell me the truth, too." The man nodded. Agreed. Daniel gave his statement. Every detail, every moment from the night before. But as he spoke, he sensed the mayor's tension rising. Something she wasn't saying. Something she didn't want them to know. When he finished, the man in charcoal nodded. "Thank you. You've been helpful." He turned to Lydia. "We'll increase security protocol immediately." Derek shot Daniel a final glare before the advisors filed out. Lydia waited until the door shut before she exhaled sharply. "I'm sorry," she said. "You shouldn't have been dragged into that." "Something happened last night," he said. "Something you didn't tell your team." Lydia hesitated. Then she walked to her desk, pulled out a folder, and handed it to him. Inside were documents, contracts, memos, internal reports, each stamped with the city seal, and each marked with a bold red word, confidential. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "Proof," she said quietly, "of corruption. Someone inside City Hall has been selling data zoning information permits, everything tied to development deals, millions at stake. And someone realized I'm getting close to naming them." Daniel felt his pulse shift. "Last night was that connected," she nodded. "Then why bring me here?" he asked. "Why involve me at all?" Her voice softened. "Because you were the only one last night who wasn't pretending. And I need someone honest or I'm not going to make it through this." Before he could respond, a sudden knock hit the door. Hard. Urgent. The man in charcoal burst inside. "Mayor, there's been an explosion in the underground parking structure." Daniel's blood went cold. "Which structure?" Lydia demanded. "Ours." They reached the garage before anyone could stop them. Smoke billowed through the entrance ramp, black and choking. Fire alarms blared through the concrete. Officers were shouting, trying to clear civilians out of the area, but clustered near the far wall was a group of workers' maintenance staff. One of the workers was yelling in panic. "There's someone still down there." The elevator tech. He went below to reset the panel and never came back. Firefighters hadn't arrived yet. The building's sprinklers weren't reaching the lower level, and the smoke wasn't slowing down. Daniel's brain didn't ask permission. It simply switched into a familiar, terrifying mode, the mode he hadn't used since the crash in the tower. He turned to Lydia. "Where's the lower access hatch?" She blinked. "Daniel, no, you can't." "Where?" he repeated. She pointed to the left, toward the elevator bank. The maintenance hatch was open but half collapsed from the blast. Smoke spewed up through it like a vent to a burning furnace. The workers tried to pull Daniel back as he moved past them. "You can't go down there," one shouted. "It's too unstable," another cried. But Daniel wasn't listening to them. He was hearing something else. Kayla's voice in the kitchen. I didn't want them whispering about me. Her voice in the hospital months ago, "Daddy, stay with me." Her voice last night, faint but brave. I don't want to be scared anymore. He grabbed a discarded reflective vest off a hook, something bright enough to be seen through smoke, and tied a damp cloth over his mouth. "Call the fire chief," he told Lydia. "Tell them to vent the west intake. And text me the blueprint of the sublevel now." Her eyes widened. "You'll get yourself killed. Someone's already dying," he said. Then he dropped into the hatch. The smoke hit him first, thick, chemical, bitter. He stayed low, crawling along the narrow catwalk until it opened into the freight corridor. Flickering emergency lights cast shadows that leaped across the walls. Something electrical had blown. He could smell burning insulation. He checked the blueprint Lydia had sent. The elevator service panel was 20 yards ahead near the backup generator. He moved fast, but careful. Years of crisis training returning in sharp, instinctive flashes. "Hey!" he shouted into the dark. "Can you hear me?" A faint cough answered. Daniel surged forward. The tech, a kid maybe 20, was collapsed near a toppled toolbox. A metal beam had pinned part of his leg. Smoke swirled around his face with every shallow breath. Daniel crouched beside him. "What's your name, Evan?" the kid rasped. "I'm Daniel. I'm getting you out." He used the toolbox as leverage, braced his shoulder, and pushed the beam upward. The metal groaned, slipped, threatened to fall again. Evan screamed. "Stay with me," Daniel said. "You're going home today." One last shove freed the beam enough to drag Evan clear. But as Daniel lifted him, a new sound echoed through the sublevel. A rumbling crack, structures shifting, fire taking deeper hold. The ceiling above them trembled. Daniel threw Evan over his shoulder, and ran. Smoke chased their heels. Concrete dust rained from above. The corridor seemed to shrink, the air thickening until every breath burned. Halfway up the maintenance ladder, Evan slipped. "I can't," he gasped. "Yes, you can," Daniel said, voice breaking. "Hold on, I'm not losing anyone today." It wasn't a command, it was a promise. One he'd failed to keep once before. One he would not fail again. With a final surge, he hauled Evan through the hatch. The moment they cleared the opening, the lower corridor collapsed with a deafening roar. Workers screamed. Lydia staggered backward as smoke blasted upward. Daniel lay on the concrete coughing, shaking his arms still wrapped protectively around Evan. Silence fell. Then the man in the charcoal suit spoke, stunned. "Mayor, he just saved that kid's life." Derek stared at Daniel as if seeing him for the first time no longer a problem, no longer a suspect, but a man who had just outrun death underground. Lydia knelt beside Daniel, her voice trembling. "You didn't just help me," she whispered. "You helped all of us." But Daniel wasn't listening. He was staring at his shaking hands. Hands that once guided planes safely through impossible skies. Hands he'd convinced himself didn't deserve to save anyone ever again. Yet here he was, breathing, alive. And so was the boy beside him. For a long moment after the collapse, no one moved. Smoke sifted through the air in thin gray ribbons curling around the emergency lights that flickered above them. The entire garage seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel lay on his back, one hand still gripping the vest he'd thrown over Evan's face, the other pressed against the concrete, to steady the world that kept tilting beneath him. Then the sound returned, boots pounding, shouts, rising radios crackling. Firefighters rushed in with hoses, paramedics with stretchers. One of them knelt beside Daniel, checking his pulse as if he were the victim. "I'm fine," Daniel rasped, pulling the oxygen mask aside. "Help him first." Evan, still shaking violently, stared up at him with glassy eyes. You climbed down there for me." Daniel nodded. "Couldn't leave you." The kid swallowed hard tears, streaking through soot on his cheeks. "I thought I was done for." Around them, the workers whispered to one another. "That guy went down there alone." "Who does that?" He pulled the kid out with the floor falling in. Even the firefighters paused when they recognized the scene. Smoke blasting out of an access hatch, a boy alive who should not have been, and a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of a different kind of battlefield. Mayor Hart stepped through the crowd, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. She looked shaken, but not from the explosion, from the way he'd thrown himself into danger without hesitation. She crouched beside him. "You saved him," she said, voice low, almost reverent. "No one else got down there in time." Daniel didn't answer at first. His heart was still trying to decide whether to race or collapse. But when he met Lydia's eyes, something in her expression shifted, a kind of dawning recognition, like she had just figured out a puzzle hidden in plain sight. "Daniel," she said softly, "how did you know where to go? How to move through the smoke? How to stay calm when the structure was about to go?" Her question silenced the murmurs around them. He hadn't realized anyone noticed. He thought he'd covered it well, counting the steps, watching the beams, feeling the air pressure shift just before the ceiling gave way. It had all come back to him so naturally that he'd forgotten it wasn't natural to anyone else. He looked down at his trembling hands, the same hands that once guided pilots through storm fronts and mechanical failures and near misses, the hands he'd avoided noticing for 2 years because they reminded him of everything he'd lost. Lydia's voice dropped to a whisper only he could hear. You weren't a parking attendant before. Were you? Daniel exhaled slowly, the truth rising like something long buried, but no longer willing to stay hidden. No, he said. I wasn't. Her brow furrowed. Then who were you? He closed his eyes for a beat. When he opened them, the words came easier than he expected. I was an air traffic controller. The room seemed to stop. Workers exchanged stunned looks. The man in the charcoal suit who had spent the morning questioning him stepped closer, studying Daniel again with new eyes. Lydia swallowed. ATC. That explains all of it. Used to, Daniel corrected quietly. Not anymore. But why would someone with that background be working in a parking garage, asked a staffer who'd once rolled her eyes at him while asking for a lost ticket discount? Daniel considered leaving the truth where it was buried safe. But something about nearly dying for a stranger in a smoke-filled basement made hiding feel cowardly. So he spoke. A few years ago, he said, staring at the cracked concrete between his boots, I made a call that saved one aircraft and cost another. The board ruled it was equipment failure. But it doesn't matter. 3 people died. I was on the frequency. I gave the wrong vector by half a second. I heard the pilots. I heard it happen. The garage fell silent, except for the hiss of hoses below. I walked away after that, Daniel continued. Couldn't sit in front of a radar again. Couldn't trust myself with anyone's life. Parking cars felt safe. No one dies if I screw that up. Lydia's voice trembled, but not with fear, with something gentler. Daniel, you saved Evan's life today. That doesn't erase what I lost, he said. No, she agreed softly. But it proves something you haven't allowed yourself to believe. You didn't freeze down there. You didn't panic. You didn't run. You assessed, acted, and brought someone home alive. That's what controllers do. That's who you are. Derek, the advisor who had accused him earlier, shifted uncomfortably, now staring at Daniel as if seeing a stranger. Shame colored his cheeks. I misjudged you, he muttered. Badly. Others nodded, murmuring similar acknowledgement. But the man in charcoal stepped forward with more purpose. Mr. Reed, if you really held that position, then you were operating at one of the highest decision-making levels in emergency response. You understand disaster patterns, structural risk, human reaction under pressure. I understand just enough to know I don't belong there anymore, Daniel said. Or, the man replied, voice steady. Maybe you walked away before anyone could remind you that one tragedy doesn't define a lifetime of skill. Daniel shook his head slowly, but the man wasn't finished. Your daughter, he said gently. You did this for her, didn't you? So she wouldn't be afraid. So she wouldn't lose someone else. The words hit harder than smoke ever could. Lydia ran a hand over her face, then looked at the man in charcoal. Tell him, she said. The man nodded. Mayor Hart is currently assembling a crisis response task group, one independent of the offices we believe are compromised. We need someone with real-world emergency experience, someone who can see patterns others miss, someone who isn't influenced by political pressure. Daniel stiffened. What does that have to do with me? Lydia knelt again, her expression open in a way he hadn't seen before. What you did today wasn't luck, she said. It was expertise, instinct, training, the kind you don't just forget. I've been surrounded by politicians who freeze when everything matters. But you... She glanced at the burned hatch behind them. You ran into danger to save someone you'd never met, because that's who you are. He didn't know what to say. Lydia filled the silence. I want you on my team. Just temporarily, she added when she saw him flinch. consulting, eyes on the ground. Someone I can trust while we root out whoever is sabotaging this city. Workers around them exchanged looks of surprise and respect. The young firefighter who had checked Daniel's pulse earlier spoke up from behind him. "Sir, most people wouldn't have made it back from that crawl space. I'm trained for this stuff and I'm not sure I would have tried." Daniel swallowed an ache rising in his chest he didn't have a name for. Respect. From people who had only looked past him before. He didn't ask for it. Didn't expect it. But hearing it now stirred something he thought had died the day of the crash. The belief that he could still contribute something meaningful even after losing everything. Lydia extended a hand, not in command, but invitation. "You don't owe me a yes," she said. "But the city needs someone who doesn't look away from danger. Someone who still knows how to listen when chaos hits. Someone like you, Daniel." He stared at her hand. He thought of Kayla at home fighting her exhaustion with stubborn smiles. He thought of the surgery bill taped inside his notebook. He thought of the crash, the sound he would never forget, and the way it had carved him hollow. He thought of Evan's coughing breath against his shoulder as he carried him up the ladder. And he realized something. Fear wasn't what kept him out of the tower. It was the belief that he didn't deserve to help anyone ever again. But today he had helped. Today he had saved someone. Not because he was perfect, but because he showed up anyway. He lifted his gaze to Lydia. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he murmured. Lydia smiled, not triumphant, not relieved, but grateful. "I'm asking you to step back into who you were," she said, "and help me protect this city before someone else gets hurt." The man in charcoal added, "We'll provide training, refresher support, security clearance, and compensation, good compensation, enough to cover medical needs for your family." Daniel's breath caught. Medical needs. Kayla, her surgery, her future. The entire world tilted again, but this time not in fear. Opportunity was standing in front of him. A door he thought had sealed forever cracked open, waiting for him to step through. Behind him, the collapsed corridor still smoked a reminder of what could have been. Ahead of him, Lydia waited. "Daniel," she said softly, "we could really use you." He hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud meant letting go of 2 years of hiding. Finally, he nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'll help." Lydia exhaled slowly, as if the world just shifted back into place. Everything was about to change again. But this time Daniel wasn't running from it. He was walking in. The fire crews stayed for hours after the collapse, but the tone in that garage had shifted long before the smoke cleared. The same workers who once greeted Daniel with distracted nods now watched him with a kind of quiet awe. Even the officials who'd eyed him with suspicion earlier stepped aside when he walked past, as if the ground rules had silently changed. Derek, red-faced and humbled, approached him near the temporary barricades. He fumbled with his words before finally saying, "I was wrong about you." The apology landed without theatrics, but the sincerity in it was unmistakable. Daniel accepted it with a nod, not out of pride, but because carrying grudges never helped anyone heal. By afternoon, teams were sweeping debris from the structure, while Lydia briefed her staff on the formation of the new Crisis Response Task Group. This time when she introduced Daniel, she didn't describe him as a witness or a bystander. She called him an asset. Someone whose experience could save lives in a city that didn't always value the people keeping it running. The man in the charcoal suit set a schedule for Daniel's onboarding, training, refreshers, clearance, access, emergency protocols. The offer came with compensation that stunned him, enough to clear the surgery bill and every related follow-up. Enough to stop choosing between groceries and medication, enough to stop fearing the next envelope in the mail. But it wasn't the money that steadied him. It was purpose returned to him, like something he'd forgotten how to ask for. When he picked up Kayla from school later that week, she clung to him with worry still lingering in her eyes. But when he told her gently that he'd helped rescue a worker from danger, she gazed at him with something he hadn't seen in her in a long time. Certainty. Certainty that her dad was strong, capable, someone she could lean on. The kind of certainty he'd never quite believed he deserved since the crash. "You helped someone's daddy," she whispered into his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." A few days later, Evan, the young tech whose life he'd pulled from the collapsing sub-level, came to see him. His leg was in a brace, but he walked with determination. He thanked Daniel again, this time with his parents standing beside him, each shaking Daniel's hand with trembling gratitude. "We wouldn't have our son if not for you," Evan's mother said. Daniel didn't know how to answer that. But he held their hands a moment longer than expected, feeling something inside him loosen. Something that had been tightening for 2 long years. Weeks became months, and the work evolved quickly. Lydia's task force exposed the corruption ring inside City Hall, unraveling the deals and data leaks piece by piece. A few officials resigned quietly. Others were removed. For once, the walls of the building seemed to echo with change rather than old promises. Daniel became a cornerstone in the new response system, designing safety protocols, mapping evacuation plans, and training staff to recognize early signs of structural risk. His instincts, once a source of torment, were sharpening again, but now in ways that built rather than broke him. At home, Kayla's health stabilized. The procedure went smoothly. Her dizzy spells stopped. She returned to her music class this time, tapping her drum with a rhythmic confidence that made the teacher smile every time Daniel picked her up. One evening, months after the explosion, the mayor invited him to a small gathering in a refurbished community hall. Nothing fancy, just neighbors and city employees celebrating the rollout of the new public safety initiative. When she took the microphone, she didn't single him out for dramatic effect. She simply said, "Some of the best things that happen in this city start with people no one notices at first. But that changes when courage steps forward." Her eyes found his across the room. Not dramatic, just grateful. Daniel lowered his head, humbled by how far he'd come from the night he hid in a dim parking booth, afraid to trust himself with anything bigger than a ticket stub. Later that evening, Lydia joined him outside on the steps as the sun dipped behind the skyline. She didn't talk about politics or emergencies. She asked about Kayla's school project, about the dog they were thinking of adopting, about how he was really doing since taking on the new role. And for the first time in years, he answered honestly. "I feel like I'm finally breathing again," he said quietly. She nodded. "Good. You deserve that." The city lights blinked awake, one by one, like stars rising from concrete instead of sky. Daniel watched them, feeling something settle inside his chest. Not triumph, not absolution, but peace. The kind that comes only after walking through the fire and realizing you're still standing. He didn't talk much about the crash anymore. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he no longer let it define the rest of his story. Kayla didn't whisper about being different at school. Lydia didn't face her battles alone. And Daniel no longer went through his days feeling like a ghost of the man he once was. He had stepped back into the world. And the world, unexpectedly, had made room for him. In the end, his story wasn't about disaster or loss. It was about a quiet truth many people forget. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the one who needed forgiveness the most. And sometimes the road back to yourself starts in the one place you never expected. A dark garage, a collapsing floor, a split-second choice that says more than words ever could. In every life, courage doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in the moment you decide not to disappear.